Welcome to the History in Focus channel. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this one.
The history of American slavery has been told, most of the time, with white men at the center. The owners, the overseers, the lawmakers. But white women actively participated in this system, as owners of enslaved people, as agents of punishment, and as architects of a control that went far beyond the physical. What they did rarely appears in books. It is in the court records, in the diaries, and in the testimonies of those who survived to speak. Fact number 1, accusation and coercion. In Virginia, in the first half of the 19th century, an enslaved man named David began to have a problem he could not report to anyone. His owner, Dolly Getz, began demanding sexual relations. When David refused, she went to court. The accusation, improper behavior, and insubordination. Dolly's word was enough. The law did not allow for an enslaved man to reject his owner. The court heard her. It did not hear him. The case of David was not an exception. It was the pattern established by the system. Enslaved men had no way to report abuse committed by their female owners without risking immediate punishment. Complaining was insubordination. Resisting was a crime. The female owners knew this with precision. Access to the bodies of the enslaved was treated as an extension of property. And when a white woman wanted to exercise that access, the legal system created no obstacle whatsoever. In Kentucky, an enslaved man identified in the records only as James was coerced by his female owner for months. When he tried to keep his distance, she sold him to the South, punishment disguised as a commercial transaction. James was never traced again in the records. This happened frequently. The enslaved man who resisted was not beaten in front of everyone. He was sold, separated from his family, transferred to where resistance was no longer possible. Sexual coercion committed by white women against enslaved men rarely appears in the records because it depended on who was writing those records. The courts did not accept the testimony of enslaved people against white people. They could not file complaints. What survived came from indirect sources, estate inventories, testimonies collected decades later, hand sales records that reveal patterns without naming the real reasons behind each transfer. The mechanism was simple and perverse. A female owner who desired an enslaved man could approach him without any consequence. One who was rejected could destroy the man who rejected her with a single accusation. All she had to say was that he had behaved improperly, that he had approached without being called, that he had looked at her inappropriately. The word of the female owner was sufficient for whippings, sale, or death. No proof was required. What makes the cases of David and James especially difficult to reconstruct is the deliberate silence around them. 19th century historians simply did not record this type of abuse as such. The language used was one of indiscipline, disobedience, or immoral behavior, always attributed to the enslaved person. What the female owner had done before was left out of the text. The silence was not accidental. It was carefully constructed and maintained for decades. The testimonies collected by the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s, when survivors of slavery were still being interviewed, brought accounts that official records omitted. Several described abuse committed by white women, not just physical punishments, but sexual coercion and constant threats. They spoke carefully, often without giving names. What they left behind was sufficient to understand that Dolly Getz and the owner of James were not isolated cases. Fact number 2, reproduction is business. In the American slaveholding South, the body of an enslaved person had market value, and that included reproductive capacity. White women who managed plantations alone understood the logic. Every child born to an enslaved woman was property of the household. Forcing reproduction was increasing the estate. What this required of the enslaved people involved did not enter the accounting of any slaveholding property. In Maryland, records from a property in the 1830s document the case of an enslaved man named Paul, coerced by his female owner to procreate with enslaved women on the farm. The woman supervised these interactions directly. There was no choice for Paul or for the enslaved women involved. The children born were recorded in the property inventory as additions to the estate. Paul did not appear in those documents as a father. He appeared as a tool. In Alabama, an enslaved man named Luke was the center of an even more explicit system. The female owner determined which enslaved women he would be paired with and when. The logic was genetic. Luke was considered physically fit, and his children would be more sellable. He had no voice in the process. The chosen enslaved women did not either. The female owner recorded these unions as cattle breeding, because for her, that was exactly what she was doing. In Brazil, one of the most documented cases is that of Roque José Florencio, known as Pata Seca, a name given for the deformity in his feet. Enslaved in the interior of Sao Paulo state, he was rented out for decades as a breeder by his female owner and by other mistresses in the region. It is estimated that Pata Seca fathered more than 200 children, all registered as property of the owners. He had no rights over any of them. Every child born was someone else's profit. Pata Seca was rented from farm to farm, as if he were a breeding stallion. The mistresses paid his owner for the service. He had no choice over where he went, with whom he stayed, or for how long. The children he fathered were sold, separated, distributed in inventories. Roque José Florencio died without having raised any of them. His name survived as a historical curiosity. What he lived through for decades had no other name besides systematic abuse. The children born from this system had no registered father. They were entered into inventories with a name, an age, and a value in dollars, sometimes months after being born. Paul, Luke, and Roque José Florencio fathered hundreds of children they never knew as their own. The female owners who profited from these births died with their fortunes intact. The men who were used for this left no fortune. They left descendants who never knew where they came from. Fact number 3. Control without leaving a mark. Not all abuse committed by white women against enslaved people left visible scars. Some female owners developed methods that hurt without showing, because enslaved people with visible marks lost market value, and because the invisibility of the abuse made any complaint impossible to sustain. The most efficient control was not the kind everyone saw. It was the kind only the victim felt and had no way to prove. One of the most documented forms was sleep and food deprivation as punishment. An enslaved woman who made a mistake, breaking an object, responding in an improper tone, taking 1 second too long on a task, could go days with reduced rations or be woken up several times at night without justification. There was no visible mark, there was exhaustion, debilitation, a body that lost strength without anyone being able to point to the cause or present it as evidence of abuse. The constant threat over children was another tool. An enslaved woman with small children was controllable far more efficiently than one without family ties. The female owner who could name the child that would be sold, or the son that would be separated from the mother, held in her hands an instrument that did not need to be used to work. The threat was enough. The look that made it clear the owner could act at any moment she wished was enough. The deprivation of privacy was another layer of control. Domestic enslaved women slept in rooms without doors, in spaces adjacent to those of the white family, accessible at any moment. There was no physical separation between their space and the space of the house. This meant there was never real rest, never a moment when they were not being observed or potentially summoned. The resulting exhaustion was not negligence. It was a control strategy applied with consistency. Accounts from the Federal Writers Project describe female owners who used household objects to punish without leaving marks. Wooden spoons, brooms, fingers that squeezed arms with enough force to hurt without forming visible bruises. The objective was pain without evidence. Enslaved women who complained of mistreatment without marks had no way to prove anything, because the absence of a mark was, for the law of the time and for any white witness, the absence of a crime. Control without marks was also psychological. Well-documented properties reveal female owners who alternated punishment with small concessions, a piece of fabric, a day off, a less harsh word. Enslaved people who could not predict the behavior of the owner lived in a constant state of alertness. That state, maintained for years, destroyed the capacity for resistance more efficiently than any whip. Fact number 4, the wet nurse market. In slaveholding America, a woman who had just had a child possessed something the market priced with precision: milk. Female owners who could not or did not want to nurse their children bought or assigned enslaved women for this purpose. The role was called wet nurse, and whoever performed it received a title that came with no rights, only the obligation to feed a white baby before her own child. Newspaper advertisements from the 19th century South are direct. For sale, enslaved woman, good wet nurse, 22 years old, newborn child. The child of the enslaved woman was included in the advertisement not out of consideration, but because buyers wanted assurance that the milk would be plentiful. The child was a technical condition of the merchandise. If separated from the mother too early, the milk would dry up. The logic was that of animal husbandry, applied to human beings without any embarrassment. What happened to the children of wet nurses was rarely good. In many cases, they were separated from the mother for long periods while she fed the white baby. In others, they received milk only after the owner's baby was satisfied. Accounts from formerly enslaved people describe mothers who arrived exhausted at the end of the day and still tried to nurse their own children with the little that remained. Some black babies died of malnutrition under these documented conditions. The demand for wet nurses created a specific market within the larger market of enslaved people. Female owners who needed a nurse bought women who had recently given birth, separating them from their own children in the process. A pregnant enslaved woman could be purchased with the expectation that she would serve as a nurse after delivery. The baby she would bear was secondary in the calculation. The milk she would produce afterward was the real value of the commercial transaction. Female owners who treated their nurses with some attention generally did so for practical reasons. A sick or poorly fed nurse produced less milk. The care was not humanitarian, it was equipment maintenance. When the white baby was weaned and the function ended, the attention ended with it. The enslaved woman returned to common labor without any recognition of what she had sacrificed to feed for months a child that was not hers. The bond that formed between the wet nurse and the white baby was real and documented. Some white babies became more attached to the nurses than to their own mothers, but the bond did not protect the enslaved woman from anything. When they grew up, many white children who had been nursed by enslaved women became owners, who treated those same women with the same indifference as always. The affection of childhood left no trace whatsoever in the power relationship that came afterward. Fact number 5. The law that protected those who already had power. The legal system of the slaveholding South was not neutral. It was a deliberate construction that made it impossible in practice for any complaint from enslaved people against white owners, men or women. Enslaved people could not testify against white people in court. They could not file complaints. The law recognized them as property, not as persons with any legal capacity to act in their own name. The Black Codes, laws passed by Southern states before and after the Civil War, defined with precision what a black person could and could not do. Walking without written authorization, gathering with others, being in public spaces without a white person nearby, all of it was a crime. For white female owners, these codes were instruments of control that did not need to be used frequently. It was enough that they existed for the threat of invoking them to work. Convict leasing was another piece of the system. After abolition, Southern states passed laws that criminalized vague behaviors: vagrancy, breach of contract, public disorder. Any black person arrested for these reasons could be rented out to private owners as forced labor. White women used this mechanism to recover workers who had left their properties after emancipation. Slavery continued, with a different name and a different form. Rebecca Latimer Felton, who would become the first woman to sit in the United States Senate, was an explicit defender of convict leasing in Georgia. She wrote articles and gave speeches actively defending the use of black prisoners as labor on farms. For her, this was a service to public morality. The fact that the crimes that sent these men to prison were frequently fabricated or irrelevant did not appear in any of her public arguments. For domestic enslaved women, the legal system created a trap with no exit. If they left the property without authorization, they could be arrested. If they stayed and were abused, there was no one to turn to. If they reported abuse, they were punished for insubordination. The law offered no way out. Every path that could lead to a complaint or to escape passed through a legal barrier built specifically to close it. It was not legislative oversight, it was design. When abolition came in 1865, the legal system did not disappear. It was adapted. The post-war black codes were passed within months. Convict leasing expanded. Vagrancy laws criminalized freedom of movement. White women who had lost enslaved people with emancipation found in the new mechanisms something that worked in a similar way. The name changed. The practical result, for many black families, changed very little. Fact number 6. Rebecca Felton and the New Regime. In 1897, Rebecca Latimer Felton took the stage at an agricultural convention in Georgia and delivered a speech that would be quoted for decades. She said that white women on rural farms lived in constant fear of black men. The solution she proposed before an audience that applauded: if it is necessary to lynch 1,000 black men a week to protect the white woman, then let them be lynched. The words were exact. Felton was not a marginal figure. She was a journalist, a suffragist activist, and a book author. In 1922, she became the first woman to serve as a United States Senator, even if only for a single day, in a symbolic appointment. Her racism was not a contradiction with her feminism. For her, women's rights were the rights of white women. The rights of black women did not appear in her arguments anywhere. This distinction was a central part of her vision. The 1897 speech had direct consequences. Ida B. Wells, a black journalist who documented lynchings in the United States, publicly responded to Felton. Wells argued that the narrative of protecting the white woman was used to justify racial terror, and that relationships between black women and white men, frequently forced, were what really needed attention. Felton responded by demanding that Wells be expelled from the country. Wells did not back down. Felton had been an owner of enslaved people before the Civil War. After the defeat of the South, she began defending convict leasing as a substitute. Her farms used the labor of black prisoners rented from the state. She wrote about it as if it were a charitable solution for men who would otherwise be idle. The records of the time show the conditions of these workers: high mortality, exhausting workdays, physical punishments without any oversight. The narrative built by Felton, the white woman as a threatened victim, the black man as a predator, had a much longer life than she did. It was used to justify segregation laws, to defend courts that convicted black men without evidence, and to silence black women who tried to report abuse committed by white men. The fear that Felton sold was real for those who bought it. The statistics about who was really threatening whom were ignored. Rebecca Felton died in 1930 at 94 years old, celebrated as a pioneer. The lynchings that her 1897 speech had helped legitimize totaled thousands of victims during that period. She never reconsidered what she had said. In her memoirs, she wrote about her life with the serenity of someone who had nothing to apologize for. The first female senator of the United States left as part of her record a speech calling for mass murder. Fact number 7, the Women's KKK. In 1923, 2 years after the relaunch of the Ku Klux Klan as a national organization, the Women of the Ku Klux Klan, the WKKK, was founded in Little Rock, Arkansas. It was not an auxiliary organization. It was an independent structure with its own leadership, a separate treasury, and an agenda that included economic boycotts, disinformation campaigns, and identification of targets for action by the male Klan. It had method, and it had funding. Lulu Markwell was the first national director of the WKKK. A lawyer and political activist from Arkansas, she had campaigned for women's suffrage before migrating to the Klan movement. Her vision was clear. The voting rights of white women needed to be accompanied by guarantees that this vote would be used to preserve racial supremacy. The suffrage she defended was not universal, nor did it intend to be. It was explicitly racial and absolutely conscious of it. Daisy Douglas Barr, a Methodist pastor from Indiana, took over the leadership of the WKKK and expanded the organization to the Midwest. By 1924, the WKKK had between 250,000 and 500,000 members across the country. Barr turned religious meetings into recruitment sessions. She used the language of Protestantism to build the argument that white Christians were being threatened by black people, Jews, and Catholics. Churches were the main distribution channel of the organization. The members of the WKKK did not burn crosses in the best-known records. Their contribution was different and, in certain respects, more efficient. They organized boycotts against black and Jewish merchants. They identified for their husbands and brothers who should be visited by the male Klan. They gathered information within spaces that men did not access: churches, women's clubs, neighborhood meetings. The intelligence work of the organization frequently came from the women. The WKKK acted politically in a direct manner. In several cities, members influenced municipal elections, supported candidates who defended stricter segregation, and pressured schools to fire black teachers. In some regions, the political weight of the women's organization was comparable to that of the male Klan. The physical violence stayed with the men. The planning, the intelligence, and the political pressure frequently came from the women of the organization. The WKKK went into decline in the late 1920s due to a mix of financial scandals and the general decline of the Klan. But the women who composed it returned to their communities without anyone asking for an explanation. They continued in civic clubs, churches, neighborhood associations. What they had done inside the organization left no public stain. The history of the WKKK stayed out of school textbooks for decades, and when it returned, it was as a footnote. Fact number 8, refugeeing, fleeing with the property. With the advance of the abolitionist movement and the growth of free states in the North, slave owners in the South began transferring enslaved people to the interior of the Deep South, far from regions where escape was more viable. The practice was called refugeeing. Female owners did this with the same frequency as men, and with the same objective, to keep what they considered their property. For the enslaved, refugeeing was one of the most traumatic experiences possible. It meant separation from everything they knew: family, friends, the land where they had grown up. It meant days or weeks of travel on foot or in wagons under brutal conditions toward regions where they would be completely unknown and where the chances of escape were smaller. Female owners who ordered this knew exactly what they were imposing on each person transferred. Some female owners used refugeeing as a specific punishment. An enslaved person who showed resistance, who tried to escape, who communicated with people outside the property, could be sold or transferred to the Deep South as a direct response. There was no contact afterward. Families were permanently divided. Children were separated from mothers. The threat of refugeeing was a control tool as efficient as any physical punishment applied on site. With the start of the Civil War, refugeeing accelerated. Female owners from border states like Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia began moving enslaved people to Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi before the Union advance could make them free. The records of these transfers show groups of dozens of people being moved on foot in winter months by the female owners who did not want to lose what they considered their property with the arrival of the troops. Mary Chestnut, a Southern female owner who kept a very detailed diary during the Civil War, recorded observations about transfers of enslaved people with a coldness that reveals how normalized the practice was. She noted the movements as if she were noting cattle, with dates, numbers, and destinations. What the enslaved people felt upon being separated from everything they knew does not appear in a single line of her personal diary. It simply did not enter the record. Fact number 9, the mistress as owner. With about 40% of slave owners in the American South were women, this statistic rarely appears in the books that describe slavery as a matter of men. White women inherited enslaved people from fathers and husbands, bought and sold them in wills, and managed entire properties without a male presence. They were owners, not spectators, and they exercised that dominion with the tools the law gave them. Lizzie Anna Burwell was an owner in Virginia in the 1850s and appears in historical records for the way she treated her domestic enslaved people. Her diaries and correspondence show a woman who monitored every aspect of life within the property: what they ate, where they slept, with whom they communicated. The word she used for enslaved women who made mistakes was correct. What the correction involved depended on the mistake and on her mood that specific day. The myth that female owners were softer than men was constructed afterward by the post-war Southern literature. The records of the time contradict this. Enslaved people who served female owners describe, in the testimonies of the Federal Writers Project, direct physical punishments, punitive sales, and threats that the female owners carried out personally, without an intermediary, without an overseer. Properties managed by widows had their own dynamic. Without a husband present, the female owner was the sole authority. There was no one to appeal to, no instance above her within that fence. Enslaved people in these conditions described surveillance without interval. The female owner always present, always watching, always making decisions. The space she controlled was total. The absence of a second white person on the property did not make things softer. White women bought and sold enslaved people independently. Inventories and wills of the time show female owners specifying which enslaved people should be sold, which transferred to children or relatives, and which freed or not. Enslaved people were listed in inventories alongside cows and farming tools, valued in dollars. What the accounts of enslaved people reveal about their female owners is more complex than the myth of feminine kindness. There were cruel female owners and less cruel ones. But cruelty was not the exception. It was a constant possibility, available whenever the female owner decided to use it. The difference between one and another was temperament, not the system. The system gave all of them the same absolute power over human lives. What each one did with it depended only on them. Fact number 10. False accusations as a sentence. In the South of the 19th and 20th centuries, the word of a white woman against a black man was, in practice, a sentence. It did not need proof. It did not need a trial. The accusation was sufficient for the lynching, and the lynching happened before any formal body could act. Between 1877 and 1950, more than 4,000 lynchings were recorded in the southern states. Many began with the word of a woman. In 1933, in Princess Anne, Maryland, a man named George Armwood was taken from jail by a mob and lynched. He had been accused of assaulting an elderly white woman. No trial was held. The mob did not wait. Armwood was beaten, dragged through the streets, and hanged from a pole. Later, investigators found evidence that the accusation was false. He was already dead when this was established. Nobody was prosecuted for the murder. The accusation of rape or sexual assault made by white women was the most common justification for lynchings in the South. Ida B. Wells documented this pattern in the 1890s and discovered something the Southern authorities did not want to acknowledge. In many of the cases where the accusation was of a sexual relationship, the relationship had been consensual or initiated by the white woman. When it became public, the accusation of rape was the available exit mechanism. Wells was threatened with death for publishing these findings. Her office in Memphis was destroyed by a mob. She had to leave the South permanently. What she had documented, that white women used false accusations to protect themselves from social scandal, was disturbing enough that the response was not to investigate. It was to silence the one who had investigated. The pattern she identified continued for decades without anyone interrupting it. A white woman who had been in a relationship with a black man, voluntary or not, knew that acknowledging this publicly would be devastating for her. The only acceptable narrative was that of the victim, and the narrative of the victim in the South had automatic and immediate consequences for the accused. There was no possible defense. No testimony from any black person outweighed the word of a white woman before the courts. The case of Emmett Till in 1955 is the most famous in this series. Carolyn Bryant accused the 14-year-old teenager of having harassed her in a grocery store in Mississippi. Her husband and brother-in-law kidnapped and murdered him days later. Decades later, already elderly, Bryant admitted that she had lied about part of what she had claimed. Till had been tortured and murdered based on something that never happened. She was never prosecuted. Fact number 11. Raised to dominate from the cradle. The power that white women exercised over enslaved people did not appear spontaneously when they became adults. It was taught. White girls grew up in houses where command over enslaved people was part of the daily routine, something learned by watching mothers, aunts, grandmothers. When a 10-year-old white girl ordered an adult enslaved woman to do something, she was practicing a power the system had placed in her hands. It was common for white girls to receive enslaved people as gifts. It was not a metaphor. They were gifts recorded in wills and letters. For my daughter, upon turning 8 years old, the enslaved woman Suki. The child received a person as if receiving a toy and grew up exercising dominion over her without anyone around questioning it as something out of place. It was the normal arrangement of life, an expected part of the upbringing of a girl of her social position. Accounts from formerly enslaved people describe white children who hit, pinched, and ordered enslaved adults around without any intervention from the parents. Some imitated what they saw, the punishments, the tones of voice, the gestures of authority. Others invented their own methods. What they all had in common was the absence of consequences. No mother interrupted a small daughter who mistreated an adult enslaved woman. It was considered normal, and in some cases, it was encouraged. Mary Prince, an enslaved woman who published her autobiography in 1831, the first account by an enslaved black woman published in Great Britain, described the behavior of white children in the houses where she served. Some treated enslaved women as objects of experiment, others as extensions of their toys. Prince documented scenes where the children of owners humiliated her with the complicity of the parents. She had no way to react without risking severe and immediate punishment. The education of white girls for dominion had an immediate practical function. It prepared them to manage a property when they married. A woman who had never commanded enslaved people, never punished or supervised, would be considered unprepared for the life that awaited her. Dominion over people was a domestic skill like any other, something expected of every white woman of a certain position, taught from childhood with naturalness. The result was generation after generation of white women who reached adulthood with dominion completely naturalized. There was no moment of questioning because it had never been taught that there was anything to question. Power over enslaved people was so integrated into daily life that its absence, after abolition, was experienced as a loss, not as the correction of an injustice. Mourning for the end of slavery existed, and it was genuine among the women raised within it. Fact number 12, the myth that history built. In the years following the Civil War, the defeated South began to construct a narrative about itself. This project, called the Lost Cause, rewrote slavery as a relatively benevolent system, and Southerners as people of honor who had fought for noble principles. At the center of this narrative, there was a specific female figure, constructed to absorb and erase what white women actually did. The figure was that of the Southern belle, the Southern lady, delicate, pure, distant from the brutal aspects of the property. A woman who blossomed on porches, who supervised embroidery, who was protected by the men around her. This image systematically erased what white women actually did on slaveholding properties: direct supervision, punishments, sales, coercion. The belle was not a description of what existed. It was a retroactive construction of what the South needed to have existed. Literature helped. Uncle Tom's Cabin, by Harriet Beecher Stowe, published in 1852, had cruel male owners and white women portrayed as more sensitive to suffering. The book was abolitionist, but the image it constructed of white women as passive figures persisted beyond the author's intention. Readers absorbed the male cruelty and forgot to ask what the women around them were doing while everything was happening. Gone with the Wind, published in 1936 and filmed in 1939, consolidated the image. Scarlett O'Hara was a slave owner, but the film showed her relationship with the family's enslaved people as something close to mutual affection. The real conditions of forced labor, the punishments, the family separations, none of it entered the narrative. The film won 10 Oscars. The image it constructed of Southern slavery lasted decades in American popular culture. The erasure did not stay only in fiction. In history books written in the first decades of the 20th century, white women appear as peripheral figures of slavery. Wives, mothers, domestic supervisors, without greater relevance. The statistics on female ownership of enslaved people were simply not included in popular accounts. The active participation of women in the system was omitted, not because the data did not exist. They existed in the inventories and wills. The voices of enslaved women were the ones that suffered the most from this erasure. Harriet Jacobs, who published her autobiography in 1861, described in detail the cruelty of her female owner, Mary Norcom. The book was left out of school curricula for more than a century. When it returned to public attention in the 1970s and 1980s, it was thanks to the work of black female historians who insisted on including it. The silence around Jacobs was not accidental, it was sustained. Mary Prince, Harriet Jacobs, and the hundreds of women interviewed by the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s left clear records. They described female owners who whipped them, who sold them as punishment, who threatened them through their children, who coerced them sexually, who deprived them of sleep and food. These testimonies were in public archives. They were ignored for decades because they contradicted the image the South had carefully constructed of itself. The myth of the passive white woman also served a political function in the post-war period. If Southern women were victims of the system, too sensitive for the brutality, distant from the sordid aspects of the property, the moral responsibility for slavery fell entirely on the men. The women could be presented as closer to the enslaved, more humane, innocent by virtue of their supposed fragility. It was collective absolution built on a lie. Historiography began to change consistently in the 1970s and 1980s. Historians like Stephanie E. Jones-Rogers produced systematic research on female participation in slavery. In the book They Were Her Property, published in 2019, Jones-Rogers documented with inventories, wills, and court records that white women did not merely participate in the system. They actively defended it when threatened and resisted abolition in concrete ways. What Jones-Rogers found was that white women resisted abolition in documented ways. They sued the federal government for compensation for the enslaved people they lost. They fought in the courts for property rights over people, and they were more intransigent than men in defending the system. The image of the passive belle simply does not survive contact with the historical archives. It was never a description of what existed. It was a defense of what was convenient to forget. What the archives show, when consulted without the filter of the lost cause, is a system where white women were agents, not spectators. They bought, sold, punished, coerced, denounced, managed. They raised daughters to do the same. They built afterward the narrative that absolved them. That narrative still circulates. In films, in outdated textbooks, in the popular imagination about what the slaveholding South was. The archives say something else.